All right. Good evening, everyone. Welcome to the Politics of Water panel discussion. I'm Mark Brody of KJZZ, the show, one of the co-hosts. I'll be your moderator for this evening. Thanks all of you for coming tonight. Thanks to all of you watching online. One quick note, if you wouldn't mind just checking your cell phones, making sure they're either off or on silent or vibrate or do not disturb, something like that. Unless you're ready for all of us to hear your embarrassing ringtone. So tonight's conversation is part of KJZZ's ongoing series of stories about water in Arizona. It's called Every Last Drop. And if you've not heard the latest round of reports, you can find the coverage at water.kjzz.org. Also, please note that tonight's event is being recorded. It'll be posted online as well. So thank you to everybody who submitted questions online ahead of time. A lot of people did, and I've tried to incorporate a good amount of them into the questions that I have here tonight. There are also note cards and pencils available here in the room tonight. So if you hear something and something piques your interest, you want to jot down a question, just write down one of those note cards, hold it up. Somebody will come by to pick it up, and we will try to get to as many of them as we can. But even if we don't, there's a lot of value in having these questions. It helps inform our coverage going forward. We want to know what you're curious about. We want to know what you want to know as well. So also I should mention tonight's event is sponsored by the Walton Family Foundation, a family-led foundation that works to create access to opportunity for people and communities. Their efforts are focused on protecting rivers and oceans and the communities they support, on improving K-12 education, and investing in their home region of the Arkansas-Mississippi Delta. Now I am honored to introduce to you our panel of experts for this evening. Starting on my far end of the table, we have Warren Tenney, the Executive Director of the Arizona Municipal Water Users Association. Sitting next to him is Stephanie Smallhouse, the President of the Arizona Farm Bureau. Third up is Cora So, Senior Research Fellow at ASU's Kyle Center for Water Policy and Arizona Water Innovation Initiative. She also previously worked in the Navajo Nation Department of Justice's Water Rights Unit. And to my immediate right is Bruce Hallen, Special Advisor to the Director of the Arizona Department of Water Resources, previously worked at SRP. Let's give them a question and answer round of applause. Thank you to all for being here. All right, so I want to start with sort of a magic wand type question. I'm going to pose it to all of you, and we'll just go down the line. So Warren, I'll start with you. If you had a magic wand, what is the one thing that you would do that would actually move the needle on the situation related to water here in Arizona?
Wow, that's a great question. And give me just a moment as I'm thinking that. But, certainly water is critical here in Arizona. You could go back to territorial days and people were questioning why anyone would live here. And we still see stories about how can Arizona have a growing population and such when it's in the middle of the desert and it doesn't have water. And the reality is we do have water. We have planned and managed and invested in that water to make sure that our residents have that water so that industries and businesses can function here and provide us a thriving economy. I think right now, if I could wave a magic wand, I would really want us to find a path forward for new supplies that could be brought into Arizona. It's important that we continue to invest in water resources and infrastructure that's necessary. There's some near-term opportunities, and we certainly need to be continuing to think of long-term augmentation opportunities.
All right, Stephanie, if you had a magic wand, what would you do?
Well, I take magic wands very seriously. So if I had a magic wand, I would fill up Lake Mead and I would fill up Lake Powell and I would fill up every basin in this state to the top. But in terms of, that's what I do. I had a magic wand.
No reason to be more or less realistic, and we're talking magic wands here, right?
Yeah, exactly. That's what I said. It's very serious.
All right. Cora, what would you do?
I think echoing those sentiments as well, more water is needed throughout the basin, not only here in Arizona, but I think for me, a lot of my work has been centered around tribal water settlements. And so finding resolution for the 14, or excuse me, 8 remaining tribes within the state, and then, of course, within the basin as well, to bring that water clarity to our state would be a dream of mine.
All right, so Bruce, it seems like there's consensus on we need more water. I don't know, is that your magic wand thing as well?
Well, good evening, everyone. It's a pleasure to be here. Of course, we live in an arid state. We live in a desert, right? And when you think about the long-term planning that's gone into water and water supplies, that's the first thing that comes to most everyone's mind that comes to locate here to this state is there enough water? And so, yeah, we could always use more water. I think in the short term, I think from my perspective, if I had a wand, it would be resolve the Colorado River negotiations so we have certainty associated with Arizona's water supply.
All right, so I want to ask, we've seen some polling recently. There was some polling that came out from a poll conducted by Morning Consult on behalf of the Walton Family Foundation. I just want to read a couple of the results here. 85% of Arizonans believe new urban development should be required to prove they have a 100-year water supply. 80% agree urgent action is needed. Arizona should invest now in groundwater management to safeguard our water resources. 92% say funding to the Department of Environmental Quality, the Department of Water Resources should be a priority. It seems as though there's generally a consensus that something needs to happen, that we need to be taking our water supplies and our dwindling to some extent water supplies seriously. So, Warren, why does it seem so hard to actually do something about this?
Well, we we do a lot of things about this. We are we we do have a 100-year assured water supply program that applies here in the Phoenix metropolitan area as well as elsewhere. And I think we need to make sure that we are doing all we can to uphold that and to keep that foundation strong. Um, I work with the Arizona Municipal Water Users Association works with the 10 major cities here in the valley. That includes Avondale, Chandler, Gilbert, Glendale, Goodyear, Mesa, Peoria, Phoenix, Scottsdale, and Tempe. Combined together, they provide water to 3.7 million people. They provide water to to businesses and industries that are critical not just to our economy, but to the national economy. What I think is so important for everyone to recognize is we have been able to have the economy that we have because it's built on the water systems that have been able to assure a 100-year supply here in the valley. And that's helped cause growth beyond those 10 cities' boundaries because of their investments in that water system. And so I think what the polling is showing is that people understand how important water is. The cities that I work for certainly understand they're in the forever business, and so they need to make certain they are providing that water. And the last thing we need to do at this point is to do anything that would weaken the 100-year assured water supply program, and we need to be pushing towards encouraging that the framework of having designations and making sure that all water providers have that ability to assure that they have a 100-year supply is in place. So I think it's important for folks to know that there's so much already in place that we're doing. It's the important thing of making sure that we keep that going forward.
So, Stephanie, I want to ask you because you spend a lot of time at the state legislature dealing with lawmakers and trying to work on bills going through the legislature. Where are the major, like, I hate to overstate it and call them battle lines because it's policy debates. We're not talking about fistfights here, but like, where are the major disagreements? Is it a partisan issue? Is it an urban versus rural issue? Is it an agriculture versus other water users issue? Like, where are the disagreements?
Well, I think that's a very interesting question in the sense that water is one of those issues that, like you said in that polling, everyone agrees that a certain access to water, whether it's the amount or the quality, all of us know that that is essential for everything, all living things. So it's obviously something at the top of everyone's mind. And so where it becomes, and it's local, right? So everybody is most concerned with their water, and so that's part of it. But I think it becomes more political in the sense that um, when you're talking about priorities, how do you prioritize that water, right? We know everyone needs it, um, but do we need it for certain things? What do we have to have it for? And so when that comes into question, it's not an ideological issue per se, because we know we have to have it. It's not a party issue because everyone knows that, everyone understands that we need to have it, but it is a priority issue. And by that, I mean, the actions that are taken in terms of statewide policy determine where our priorities lie. And that can get to be a very intense conversation, especially, I'm talking and speaking from the perspective of agriculture. So if you think about the water appropriation process that we have in Arizona, we talk about water in terms of priority, right? Well, literally in terms of priority, it's not a coincidence that agriculture holds some of the oldest priority in any state where that's the way the water law works. It's because agriculture first developed those water systems. Agriculture first put water to use. And why is that? It's because the priority when the West was settled, when Arizona was settled, was food production. That was the priority, produce food so that people could live here. So therefore, agriculture in a lot of these areas has the highest priority. The question is, when you're looking at all of these other competing priorities, how do you determine how to balance that? In groundwater, we don't have a priority system. So,
Well, especially because some of those industries didn't exist, right? Like, there was no data centers back then. There was no semiconductor manufacturing when Arizona was first being settled. So, and I think, to your point, agriculture, it uses a lot of water, and it, rightly or wrongly, excuse me, seems to take a lot of blame for the amount of water that it uses. So I'm curious, like, from your perspective, how do you prioritize farmers being able to make a living and producing the food that we need to eat with all of the other stuff that has expanded since those water rights were first granted, 100 plus years ago?
well, I don't think it's an either or question. I think that agriculture has done quite a bit in the range of millions and millions of dollars to implement conservation measures in terms of using water, because a lot of folks forget that um, folks in agriculture, we tend to notice things in terms of the climate and things that are happening with the soil and the water before everyone else does. And so it's not like farmers and ranchers across Arizona woke up 10 years ago and said, "Oh my gosh, we are in a drought, the worst drought in 1,200 years." No, we've felt it for a long time. So there's an awareness there that precedes a lot of what the state is doing. Um, I think that agriculture using most of the water, I don't think this, I know this, agriculture using most of the water is not an anomaly in Arizona. Agriculture uses 70% of the water for the whole world. And if you have a situation ever where agriculture isn't using most of the water, then you probably don't have any agriculture. That's just the way it works. Each of you in here look like pretty healthy people that eat a well balanced diet. You're consuming 800 to 1,000 gallons of water a day in the food that you eat. And so, from an agricultural perspective, in terms of priority, we are prioritizing the consumer by being able to use that water.
Cora, I want to ask you from a both an overall state perspective, but also you spent some time working on the Navajo Nation. Tribes for a long time, as we know, were not really at the table when some of these rules were being made and rights and priorities were being granted. So how are tribes trying to sort of make up for lost time, if that's the right phrase, and make sure that they are getting the water that they are entitled to and that they need? Again, to what we were talking about, Stephanie, with all of the other competing priorities, and the fact that they haven't really had the opportunity to be involved in this for so many years.
I think that going back to the previous question and the context of tribal water rights and the framing of it, of pitting users in the system against each other, um, should be shifted when we talk about tribal water rights, because we're really talking about human um, human water human water rights and access to clean water. In the Navajo Nation, a third of households don't have access to clean running water, and that's a daily issue for them. And they community members don't have the luxury to think about building out a city or agriculture or um, you know going to school. They're thinking about how to continue to conserve water and make sure their relatives are taken care of. And that is, I think, equivalent to a lot of the struggles that we see throughout the state, and is something that is not um, unique to tribal nations. Thinking about some of the recent progress that tribal nations have had within the state and within the Colorado River Basin, I think is a direct product of having discussions like this and having more dialogue and coverage of these issues. And I think bringing people in who have studied not only water law, Western water law, but also Indian law, and universities like ASU and the U of A and NAU really investing in Indian legal programs and bringing on professors to talk about how our people used this land and cultivated this land generations before statehood, and had set the foundation for what our cities and towns currently thrive off today, and continue to contribute to the success of Arizona by being unable to use their unquantified rights that water flows down the river and comes into our homes here in the city and goes into California. And so I think by that and talking about those issues and highlighting how much impact, positive impact, tribes have had on state water policy, either by being excluded or um, let into conversations but not being able to vote or make headway in that respect, are really unique challenges that tribes are dealing with in the aspect of water. But I think it's important to note that water is just a aspect of tribal nation building, and is one thing that tribal leaders have on their plate in addition to dealing with so many other issues. And so um, I think in summary, it's just having more discussions like this and having people interested in learning about this history and the history that existed before the state was established.
Bruce, we have heard for so many years in this state that water traditionally has been a bipartisan issue, right? Like Democrats and Republicans have gotten together to work on the Central Arizona Project to pass the Groundwater Management Act in 1980. Do you still see water as a bipartisan issue in Arizona?
This isn't realistic, but you would hope that politics would never enter into water, but that's just not the case. I feel as if uh, there there is um, bipartisan work being done currently between both parties, but I do feel as if partisanship is much stronger than it's ever been, and you do see it bleeding over into water at times. And I don't think that's a good trend for any of us, since we all have the same requirements and same needs. And you heard three different groups here that talked about their interests and the interests that they represent. But you also have industrial users that have interests. You have recreational users, you have environmental users, and then you have a wide variety of different governmental organizations that you have to interact with. So it's very complicated. At times, I have bumps on my head from beating my head against the wall. But the fact of the matter is that listening to each of these organizations and working together with each of them is very, very important. I I do want to point out that water is an issue that decisions are made for the long term. Decisions aren't made lightly, they aren't made quickly because water is so important here in this desert state. I was accused one time by an organization that I worked with that we were making decisions at a glacial pace. Well, but when it comes to water, and I've mentioned this before, certainty is critical. Like in any business enterprise that you operate in, certainty is critical. And in water, that's the case. Now, when does water make quick decisions? It's during a crisis. And during a crisis, sometimes you make real good decisions, maybe not such good decisions. But I think it's very, very important that the partisanship stays at bay. I realize there will always be politics associated with water since there's a wide variety of influences and uses, etc. That's the reality. But I still see nonpartisanship and working together and trying to resolve some of these water challenges.
Well, so Warren, Bruce mentioned sometimes you have to act in a crisis. We saw that a few years ago when the state legislature passed the drought contingency plan. But I also wonder, to Bruce's point about making long-term decisions, that doesn't always fit in with the needs of politicians, right? Who are in the state legislature, they're running every 2 years. A governor is running every 4 years. How much of a conflict is that trying to pass legislation that might not see any fruit for a decade or more when you have an election coming up in less than 2 years?
If I could grab that magic wand again,
You
I
got one
would.
wish. That's it. Sorry.
Oh, okay. But I still would, that's one of the challenges is trying to convey to legislators, not saying they're not wanting to do this, but just trying to really emphasize how important their decisions today will have on future generations. And that when it comes to water, we have to make smart decisions. We're all doing the best that we can. I believe Arizona has done a great job on many levels, from what the municipalities do to at the state level with our, from the Groundwater Management Act to the Assured Water Supply Program to the investments that have been made into the infrastructure and resources. But that said, we're not perfect and we still have a lot to work on. And it has been very challenging because, for example, this legislative session, 95 water bills have been introduced. I've been working in water for a while, and I've never recalled that many bills being introduced. I would say half of them have been trying to dealing with something in the rural Arizona. The other half have been dealing with here in urban Arizona. And a lot of them is a knee-jerk reaction to last June, when the Arizona Department of Water Resources issued the updated projections for the Phoenix AMA groundwater model. And that showed that over the next 100 years, we would be having more demand than groundwater. And that's a problem. We've always taken a foresight of looking ahead, and that's one of the reasons Arizona has been so successful. Because of that finding on the model, that has placed a pause or a halt on development outside of a designated provider within a 100-year assured water supply. That's created a lot of angst, frustrations, and such for those communities and development areas that have been planning development outside of designated providers. And so what we've been seeing a lot on is this effort this year with a lot of the bills to try to change the model somehow, try to undermine the assured water supply program. And we've been trying our best to explain to the legislatures this will not be good for Arizona in the long run. A short-term fix, we understand. We appreciate why you would want to make a short-term fix for specifically development or the home building industry on the far west and east valley. But we have to be really smart and we have to make wise decisions on water. Why? Because again, our whole economy, all of the industries, all of the um, businesses that are here, our homes, all of the communities that we live and enjoy being in is all based on the foundation that we have the water. And we need to always keep that first and foremost. And so some of the solutions aren't so near term. And that's frustrating for lawmakers who want to make a decision right now and show that they're doing something to help at this moment. But we can't make short-term decisions that undermine all the progress that we've made up to this point, or that would set us up in a situation that would draw more questions rather than certainty about how Arizona is handling its water.
Bruce, go ahead.
Yeah, I just wanted to add to Warren's comments and to the legislators. Water's a very complicated subject. There are, very extensive regulations. There's laws. There's contracts. There are a variety of other items out there that essentially dictate how we manage water in this state. And for a legislator, they're bombarded with a variety of issues, and it's not just water. For us, that's our livelihood. But I can tell you that I'm still learning. I've been doing this for 40 years, and I'm still learning. And so I'll come to the legislator's defense, the fact that it's very, very complicated. And so from our perspective, we probably need to do a better job of educating the legislators and probably need to do a better job of educating all of you. Now, if you're like my wife, after 5 minutes, she's bored. And so I realize that, but that's a good thing, right? I mean, we don't want you to have to worry about your water supply. None of us do up here. But as Warren said, yeah, we're at a point now at this state where we're reaching some limits, and it's kind of a different era. And looking to the future, it's going to require all of us working together, all of us collaborating and developing these longer term solutions to ensure long term resiliency of the water supply for the state. And when you think about the state, and Stephanie can appreciate this because she represents people throughout the state of Arizona, but you have users on the Colorado, much different setup than you have a user maybe in southwest or southeast Arizona. That's a farmer in southeast Arizona. And then you have the Flagstaff area, their water uses and their water challenges are much different. And then you have here in the valley, huge infrastructure projects that you all have paid for to ensure that you have a long-term reliable supply that's in partnership with the federal government. You've got the Salt River Project and you've got the CAP, Big Canal. You don't necessarily have that in other areas of the state. And so there's also that challenge too between, okay, you've invested here in these major urban areas. There are challenges. We're moving forward. We see some limits. What can we do in the future? And we're starting to plan for that. But you have areas in the state where they have problems right now and they need help right now. And we're working on that and hoping that we can come up with some workable programs that are reflective of the unique characteristics of these areas of the state to ensure that they have a long-term resilient water supply.
Stephanie, I wanted to ask you something about what Bruce was just talking about in terms of entities that need help right now. And if you wanted to add something onto Bruce, you can sort of append that on as well. But I wanted to ask you because you were one of the things that you said when you withdrew from the Water Policy Council, the governor's Policy Council, is that, and I'm going to quote from the release, we believe a new and innovative approach for the protection of water users and their uses is a prerequisite for any new regulatory structure in rural Arizona. Secondly, any new regulatory process must be driven by a locally elected planning body. So I'm curious, like, are there how much agreement or disagreement is there in rural Arizona and even within agriculture specifically about what the right answer is?
Well, yes, if I could first sort of
Yes.
piggyback on the last two, just to say quickly, and it relates to the council. We were criticized heavily for exiting from the council. And one of the reasons that we did that was because we felt like it was moving too quickly. And we felt like there wasn't time to get into the weeds and into the details because, as Bruce said, water is extremely complicated on all levels for all users. And it takes time to sit around the table just for agriculture. And you asked the question, Mark, that you know, even within agriculture, there are differing needs and differing priorities. There are different environments that people in agriculture are working in. If you're farming in Yuma, you have a very different farming environment than if you're farming in Safford, Arizona. You're farming different things. And so that creates a lot of complication. And because of that, we can't be, as you said, Mark, we can't be planning on a political timeline. We have to be given the time to sit and have these discussions in a way that we can make good decisions. Because as Warren said, these are long-term decisions. They're going to last for a long time. The decisions that were made about the active management areas were 40 years later now down the road. And we're seeing some issues in agriculture as a result of decisions that were made then. And so we want to take the time that if, now that we're getting another opportunity to create some water management frameworks, we want to take the time, and nothing done right, should be done in a hurry. And so that's what we've been trying to do. And it can be difficult because, as Bruce said, there's so much to know about water. The only stuff that I talk about is related to agriculture. I don't understand what's going on in the municipalities, but I can come to the table and I can say that cut is too much. With that much water cut, farmers can't grow food. And so a lot of times in the lawmaking arena and the sausage making, as they say, there's a lot of arbitrary numbers that are thrown out. Well, why don't we do this? Let's cut this much. Let's have farmers grow this. Why can't farmers put in drip irrigation? Why can't they do this? And there's a lot of complexity in that. Those are decisions that do not fit every farm all over Arizona. And so we have to have the opportunity to have those discussions. And that was one of the reasons why we did step off the council, because sometimes to be heard, you have to leave the room and you have to be able to say, stop, slow down. We have things to say that matter and that are complicated, and we need to be able to flesh these things out. And we can't do it in the next 4 weeks. And so, so that was something that we did. And from Farm Bureau's perspective, as Bruce said, we have farmers and ranchers that are members from the whole state, and they grow everything from wine grapes to cantaloupe to have goat milk to, anything, 270 products you can get in Arizona. And we have taken probably the last 8-9 years just within our own organization to talk to all of these farmers and come to consensus on how water policy will work for agriculture in Arizona. I do want to say something that I think a lot of folks don't realize, and I understand why, because not everybody's on the farm and understands the farming dynamics, but 40% of the food that's produced in the world has to be irrigated. 70% of the fruits and vegetables that are grown in Arizona are irrigated. 80% of the orchard crops are irrigated. And so I think a lot of people often think back to what Warren said, well, why do we grow food in Arizona? Why are we even farming in Arizona? We farm here. We don't farm here in spite of the climate. We farm here because of the climate. Through irrigation, we can control all of those things that we do. And because we can control it, we're highly efficient and we get greater yields in a lot of places in the country. And so these are the types of things that we have to explain that we can't explain in short order. We have to explain why arbitrary numbers just being thrown at us, depending on what you grow, is not going to work. So.
Or I'm going to paraphrase a question that we got from somebody ahead of time, and I apologize because it's kind of an impossible question. But given everything that everybody here has said, that these decisions take time, that there are lots of different entities with often competing interests, what is the sweet spot in terms of making decisions? Because we don't necessarily have a decade to make these decisions before we're in a worse situation than we're in now. So what should, like, ideally, what should the decision making process and the policy making process look like, given that to an extent we have to act reasonably quickly, not maybe in a month, but reasonably quickly, but yet these decisions are very long term and there's a lot of disagreement and a lot of competing needs.
Well, I'll start by saying that is an impossible question, but I'll give it a shot. I think as I've started in this work, a lot of the issues that I've seen have persisted for decades and for generations. And I think being in the room with tribal leaders who often are fighting about who was here first can be a conversation that could last for many more generations. But I remember being in specific meetings and thinking about how these issues continue to persist while the climate is changing, while people have to conserve. I talked to community members on the Navajo Nation who live on a daily basis off of 10 gallons of water a day. And so thinking about shortages, thinking about cuts, those are what people in rural Arizona live with on a day-to-day basis, and have that mindset and continue to teach their children to live in that way. And I feel like when we hear about these decisions need to take more time, it's hard to hear when people are at the forefront of experiencing climate change. And so I feel like there should be some solutions, or a body of people who can create these short-term flexible solutions, and also a body of people who work on these long-term solutions that are compatible with each other. And I don't know if that's possible, but I do feel like, of all the research that I've seen, these communities who don't have access to infrastructure or delivery of water experience all of the issues that we talk about in the future, or what we are going to experience here in the city. And so it's hard to hear that we need to take more time. We have 100+ years of water policy history and agreements to look back on, and to analyze and criticize and see what went right and what went wrong. And I think that there's enormous privilege and opportunity to look back on those examples. And also, I think with new technology and new human capital, we have the opportunity to look across the globe at different places to see how other people are working in these different climates, and how, of course, all of our laws are very specific, but I think that there's opportunity there to see solutions and build upon that.
Two different entities. That sounds like you're doubling the amount of fighting that can happen over who gets to sit on those boards.
I Maybe, but I feel like if you're having a fight, you have all the people in the room who care about the issues and who are represented there. So I feel like if it's a silent room, then you're not having that diverse perspective.
Warren, I want to ask you a question that was submitted ahead of time, which is, this is obviously a conversation about the politics of water. So why is it that political candidates for office don't really ever talk about water on the campaign trail? Why is that not an issue that gets brought up?
I think that sometimes I think one of the reasons for that is we do such a good job that it's not the immediate crisis out there. In other words, there is no crisis at this moment. You all were able to take showers this morning. I'm assuming you had the water that you needed for when you got up this morning. The municipalities here in this valley do a really good job of making sure that the water is delivered every day to where they need. And at the end of the day, it's those municipalities that have the responsibility to make sure you have water. We love the Central Arizona Project. We love this Salt River Project. They're important supplies, but it's the responsibility of the municipalities to deliver that water. And because we do such a good job of that, I think politicians, lawmakers are don't there's more other needs that are right in front. With that being said, I think one of the challenges that we're having right now is to convey to lawmakers, to the general public, that we are entering a very interesting time when it comes to water. The cities have done a great job of preparing and planning, looking ahead, considering worst case scenarios and such. But they recognize that there's challenges ahead. And that includes everything from, Bruce mentioned, the negotiations on the Colorado River. How much water will reclamation provide after 2026? What we do know is that we're going to have less Colorado River water than we have today. But it is really challenging because we don't know exactly how much less. So without that certainty, it really is a challenge for water providers to know exactly what do they need to prepare for in that regard. And why do they care about it? Not because they're not suddenly not going to be able to deliver water. That's not the case. It's how do they take then their other resources and be able to make sure that it's stretched and make sure that existing demands, all of you, have water. That also, the other thing that makes it sort of I'll use the word precarious time, is the Phoenix area aquifer is under stress. As I mentioned earlier, we've reached kind of our limit on groundwater. Therefore, we need to make some smart decisions because depending on exactly how much less Colorado River water we're going to have, cities are going to need to utilize their well fields where they have been storing extra water when we had extra water coming from the Colorado River. And being able to utilize that supply, but doing it in a smart way. And the challenge is we don't have new water supplies on the near, or like tomorrow or next year. There is efforts, everything from working on expanding Bartlett Dam on the Verde River, Salt River, the SRP and Reclamation are working to do that. And that could provide additional amount of water for this valley. But we will be making a case that needs to make sure that that's for that first and foremost that we have backup for having less Colorado River water. The other really important supply is the utilization of advanced water purification. Direct potable reuse is another name. It is a way to be able to make sure that we are recycling our water over and over and getting every drop that we can in the same way with the same technology that NASA has done for years when they send astronauts up into space. We're just bringing that technology down to Earth and utilizing it and doing what Mother Nature does in a faster way. Those are things that the city of Phoenix is looking at, a regional approach. That would be important also, but that's something that's happening that's not going to necessarily be up and running until 2030. So it's happening at the same time as we find out about the Colorado River. The reason why I'm going on about this is because I'm just pointing out all the challenges of the pieces right now. That is why we need to make extra smart decisions at this time. And that includes particularly in making sure that municipalities are supported in being able to support their water systems. And that includes making sure that the Assured Water Supply Program stays strong.
Stephanie, go ahead.
Yeah, I just wanted to, that goes back to one of my opening comments in terms of why, why is it difficult for lawmakers to talk about this? And I have, empathy for them in the sense that two people sitting next to each other will have very drastic differences on what they think about water. Two towns next to each other can have very drastic priorities. Two farmers next to each other can have very drastic priorities. So it is difficult. But I did want to say that even though there's even though no one here in this room or um and obviously with the exception of the serious water issues that we have on the a lot of the Indian sovereign lands with access to water, in terms of the municipalities and the cities, no one is experiencing a shortage, at all, really, even for extemporaneous uses of water. But it shouldn't be forgotten that there's a lot of farmers in central Arizona that have already lost their water. And so they are experiencing those actions already from what's happening on the Colorado River. And so, how many of you, they've fallowed 40% of their acres because they lost access to that water. They're really the only ones in Arizona that have lost water to date because of the shortage. It's pretty hard to keep in business when you lose 40% of your income. But I do have a good story about that I want to share. There is a farmer in that area, in the Pinal County area, and also kudos to the legislature um, in providing the different funding that they've been providing, different funding sources, because that's part of the politics as well, right? How do we prioritize the funding? How do we move money around to address these shortages? And some money has been provided in the last couple of years in terms of irrigation efficiencies. Farming is a very, highly capital intensive investment in terms of year to year. You have to get financing just to plant a crop, much less go buy a tractor or whatever. And so this funding has been made available to these farmers in central Arizona. And this farmer was able to go in and take 600 acres that he had had to fallow after losing his water, was able to obtain some of this funding through the University of Arizona. They're administering the fund, and it's an irrigation efficiency program. It took him 2 years to transition about half of those acres. That's a long time, and it's a huge risk to him. He had spent millions of dollars years earlier lasering those fields to make sure there was no loss of water when he watered those crops.
Leveling them out.
Yeah,
Laser
yeah,
leveling
I'm
them out.
sorry, laser leveling them out. And then for someone to come to him and say, well, really what you should be doing is you should put in some pivots and you should make your efficiency this much higher. But in order to do that, you're going to have to move all of this dirt around that you paid millions of dollars in order to laser level. And this 8 miles of ditches that you've put in around your farm to transport this water that you no longer have, you're going to have to rip them all out because you're going to need that pivot to move around. That's a huge risk to a farmer. And so financing is a huge part of this problem. It's a huge part of addressing conservation on the agricultural side. So he took that risk. He said, okay. And he basically tore up all of his work, practically from a generation worth of time, and put in the pivots. And now he's got about half of that production back up and running. And so that's a good story, but it's not without risk. It's a huge risk for agriculture in the state of Arizona to make big changes quickly. And so that goes back to that question of transitioning. So I just wanted to make sure that people were aware of that part of the policy of it.
I thought I'd make a quick comment. The person that asked the question, I don't know what social media outlets that they access, but I've seen more conversation about water from our congressional delegation, mayors, city council members, and legislators than in the last 30 years. And so to me, they are talking about it. And I think they are engaged. So that's just my perspective.
Corey, I want to come to you with another question from that somebody had submitted earlier, related to, we've all talked a little bit about what the legislature does. The state is, of course, facing a pretty significant shortfall, 600 plus million for the rest of this fiscal year, 600 plus million for next fiscal year. Should we be concerned about water programs potentially being cut? I mean, we saw earlier this year the head of WIFA, the Water Infrastructure Finance Authority, if I'm getting that acronym correct, was really concerned about the $300 million they're supposed to get being cut to $30 million. So, like, should we be concerned about the financial realities and the political realities coming out of the legislature budget wise as it relates to water programs this year and next?
Yes, I think we should be very concerned. And I think it's worth noting how we've managed our funds, of course, and having that public dialogue, but seeing the impact of how our different tax laws have had a direct impact on our state budget is really informative. In a previous role, I did state tribal tax policy, so understanding the nuances of our state funds and how that is incorporated into the state general fund um, was really impactful. But seeing again, this accounting of not only money, but in our field, thinking about our water, we're dealing with generally some same deficits, and uh, it's a hard way to create policy when you're in the negative and think that we're going to come out positive. I think that that's something that goes hand in hand with how we are planning. But something that I feel personally that I haven't seen in the water community or in the state policy community is this general sense of have we um, grown too much, or have we are why are we not also having the discussion of where are areas where maybe this development doesn't make sense in a time like this. So thinking about conversations like that is also, I think, part of that discussion too, and I think could help alleviate some of the stress, because I don't see that discussion happening. I see this discussion of growth and how are we um, trying to plan for more with less. And so I think that that's also something I hope is highlighted in this discussion too.
Warren, go ahead.
Yeah, just in regards with finances, I earlier was talking about the challenges about water resources and water supplies. Um, your water provider is facing many enormous financial challenges. Just as you as individuals have been dealing with inflation, supply chain disruptions, so too are your water utilities. They've been struggling with those issues. Um, they have capital projects that and a water system that they're daily trying to maintain, but there's also trying to upgrade because unfortunately infrastructure ages and you have to make upgrades to meet ongoing and future needs. Uh, there's tightening federal regulations on water quality. That means that more has to be spent on to make certain that the water that you receive meets the Safe Drinking Water Act. And that increases the price of safe drinking water. There's also, unfortunately, because I think working in water is great, there's an aging workforce, and there's tight job market that complicates the recruiting and retention of water professionals, from operators of treatment plants to just all aspects of what it takes to make certain that you have water every day. If you know somebody, particularly on the younger side, that you could say, hey, you want to make sure that you want to go in a good profession, water is a good place to go because we're always going to need it. And so we need to uh, show the importance of that. And I guess I'm just mentioning that is that I think it's really important that when you think about your water system and your water that you receive, it does cost. Cities are very careful. The last thing they want to have to do is raise your water rates. But any investment in water is an investment in our certainty, in our water security, which is important for our future. And so I just think it's important that we recognize that water is going to keep increasing in a cost. And it's important that that your water system, water provider is investing in the water. So I just wanted to mention the challenges there.
Bruce, we've gotten this far without really delving into the Colorado River. So I'm going to rectify that right now because your agency is involved in interstate negotiations with 6 other states in the Colorado River Basin. And I'm curious to get a sense of the dynamics at play, both, for example, between Arizona and California, which have essentially hated each other over water issues for decades. I mean, like really bitter fights between those 2 states, but also they're very much on the same side in terms of trying to make sure that the lower basin states, of which both Arizona and California are parts of, are getting what they think they need and what they think they deserve from the upper basin. So how does that dynamic work?
Yeah, if you could think about what we're discussing here and now think in terms of 7 states working together on water issues and water policy, right? I can tell you that I think California and Arizona working together have come to the realization that there is a structural deficit associated with that water supply when it comes to the amount of water that's coming off the Colorado River watershed. And I'll include the state of Nevada because they're part of the lower basin. It's a bifurcated system. You have the upper basin, which is everything above Lake Powell, essentially, and which includes Utah, Wyoming, Colorado, and New Mexico. And then you have the lower basin states. The lower basin states are very much dependent on the storage in Lake Powell and Lake Mead. But with California, I think California also came to the realization the federal government had developed some near-term environmental impact statements regarding potential draconian cuts on the Colorado River based off of anticipated flows into the system. And I think California realized that they could see significant cuts to the Colorado River. So they realized that they had to work together with the lower basin states to come up with a workable solution, at least for the near term. Warren talked about the year 2026. There's a near term program in place where the lower basin states are conserving 3 million acre feet of Colorado River water over that time period. And in the interim, the states are working on shall we say, a new plan associated with um, uh, allocations and entitlements associated with the Colorado River to each of the basin states. I think from the lower basin states' perspective, they realize that because of climate change and because of less inflows into the system, that there will be most of the time there will be cuts based off entitlements. When the reservoirs are at higher levels, they anticipate that we'll continue to use our full share of water. But the lower basin believes that the upper basin also needs to share in those reductions and those cuts, and that hasn't happened to date. And so that's a big area of contention, but I can tell you that the conversations remain. I'm working together with the federal government, the Bureau of Reclamation. And if I could just point something out for the state of Arizona, the state of Arizona has benefited very strongly from investments by the federal government when it comes to water. And I just want you to all understand that we've been a beneficiary of large investments from the federal government. Federal governments continue to make those investments. Federal government's making investments potentially has historically made investments in Indian water settlements in developing infrastructure. And there's other Indian water settlements that are on the books where we're looking to the federal government to invest significant dollars to develop infrastructure associated with those Indian settlements. And so I just want to put it in perspective that Arizona has a very unique and positive relationship with the federal government, especially when it comes to water.
So Bruce, do you see the relationship between Arizona and California? Is it a full-on détente, or is it more a matter of like both states are realizing that they need to unite to, for lack of a better word, fight the upper basin and make sure that the states can come to an agreement so the feds don't impose something that maybe nobody's going to like?
I think everyone wants to avoid potentially the feds imposing something because, right, you lose control. And I think there is a definite cooperative atmosphere between the lower basin states in addressing management of the Colorado River.
So, Warren, I want to ask you a question that we got from an audience member here. You were talking earlier about the 100-year assured water supplies, and the question is basically, is it realistic to continue to require those given rapid climate change and the fact that the science, like the conditions are just changing so rapidly that today maybe you say you have a 100-year water supply, but in 30 years, maybe you don't?
So that question often comes up in regards also with, you to show that you have a 100-year assured water supply, you can't be solely dependent on groundwater. You have to show that you're using other supplies for that. And so the big ones been the Colorado River and Salton Verde River water for the Phoenix Valley. And so one of the positive things about the Assured Water Supply program is it's not just issued and you're done. You have to show every 10 to 15 years that you then can do 100 years going forward again. So there's a renewal process that goes on. So there's that check and balance that helps.
Okay. Cora, I want to ask you another question that we got from somebody who submitted ahead of time, and this is perhaps more of a metro, a valley question, maybe even a Pima County, more urban question. But the question is essentially, will how likely is it that water shortages will affect real estate values over the next 20 years?
As much as I would love to answer that question, I feel like it's out of my wheelhouse.
Okay.
So
Who
I
else
would
would like
love
to take
to
it then?
pivot to somebody on the panel.
Warren, do you want to take that one since you work with the cities?
Yeah, I'll give a try. I think one of the things that's been frustrating this session in dealing with different legislation is there's been trying to link that that we have to make changes to the groundwater model, or we need to make changes to the assured water supply program because it's impacting affordable housing or impacting just available housing. Water, we've already noted, is complicated. Housing is also a very complicated issue. The issues that are surrounding affordability, available housing at this time was created long before the Phoenix AMA groundwater model came out. And I just think it's important to keep it separated because at the end of the day, if we undermine the Assured Water Supply program today for some short-term gains. I mean, I think there's ways to work it through. I think there is efforts at the legislature as well as with Arizona Department of Water Resources and through the Governor's Water Council of working on a path forward for development, of providing a way for water providers that are not designated to become designated. It's called the alternative path to designation. And because of that, that has a lot of potential. And that's something that we should look for because it works within our framework and the principles of the Assured Water Supply program. My point is if we do other things that that would undermine our efforts just because we want to build a few more houses in the far west or the far east of this valley, that's not going to change the housing issue, but it will create challenges that we will have for raising questions about how serious is Arizona about staying true to its water management and ensuring water security. There's a much bigger economy and a bigger things that we need to make sure that the foundation of our water security is not weakened.
Stephanie, we talked earlier about local control, local decision making over water, and I'm curious if you think we're going to see more of that, especially in rural parts of the state, but not necessarily coming from elected leaders, but coming from just plain residents there. We saw that a few years ago with one of the residents of one of the groundwater basins in Cochise County deciding to put themselves in an AMA, in an active management area, while another one very close by decided against that. Is that the kind of like, do you expect more of that going forward? That people in particular areas are going to try to take matters into their own hands?
Well, I think that it's definitely an opportunity for communities to come together and figure out what it is that they're interested in, right? What it is that they're focused on, what their priorities are. The fact remains that the state of Arizona controls groundwater. And so a community can only do so much. You can't just a mayor can't just make a decree that now this is going to be the law of the land in some town. The Department of Water Resources has a little bit to say about that. So, but so to some extent, yes. But what we are trying to do, and I probably didn't make this clear before, and I want to make sure I make this clear. When we left the Governor's Water Council, we didn't just go home. We regathered our resources. We created a very large stakeholder group of agricultural interests from around the state, and we kept working on our own. And many of you may be aware that we have presented an option to the governor, and we continue to work literally up to today on that proposal, and it includes an element of local control. We've always felt that was very important, and the reason we feel that's important is because the areas of Arizona all have different water challenges. They all have different economic drivers. They all have different planning goals, all these different things. And so to try to take something that was passed in the 1980s, which was really the focus was those AMAs that it created, and then apply it to other places in the state is not going to work because there are tools at play for those areas that are AMAs that are not available for other areas of the state. And so what we're trying to do is come up with a framework and be proactive. We're not trying to ignore that there's a problem. I mean, if anything, like I said, farmers notice before anyone and they're concerned about the issue. And so we're trying to be proactive, but we're also trying to allow rural communities to continue sustainably and not sort of cut them off at the knees. And at the same time, give them a voice to say, well, this would work well for our part of the state, given the conditions that we have and the things that we know we can accomplish and with the resources that we have. And so it creates a certain amount of flexibility. What we would prefer is a certain amount of flexibility so that local communities will have that ability to do that within a framework that the state has granted as okay, right? That the Department of Water Resources has said, yes, this will work. The political process has said, yes, this will work. And so that's something that we're continuing to work on. And I just wanted to comment, something that you asked Warren about the real estate. There's another Morning Consult survey, and it tells us that 90% of the public across the nation wants to have a local food supply. And so a lot of you may not be wondering about farmland values, but I would like to bring this up because it's part of the conversation that hardly ever gets discussed in conversations about regulating water. Almost every farmer or rancher has to get financing in order to go through the crop cycle, whether that's a livestock cycle or a crop cycle. And that happens every year on an annual basis. I promise you that the people who are ag lenders that loan money to farmers to do that crop cycle every year are listening to our conversations. They're watching what's happening with water law in Arizona. They're watching what's happening to access to water quality, water quantity. And so that's another reason why we have to be very deliberate in whatever it is that we come up with, because people often ask me, how did farms get so big? Well, a lot of times farms get bigger because smaller farms can't sustain, whether that's because of regulation or inflation, the cost of doing business, the commodity prices, so they consolidate. And that's how farms get bigger, because smaller farms consolidate. And so if we can do something to help those smaller farmers stay in business and work alongside those larger farmers, that's something we want to do. If we impact the value of farmland, like what happened in the 1980s, that was the first huge exodus in modern times of small farms out of farming. If we can avoid that, that's something we should try to do. And farmland values is going to impact that. And so if we can pass a framework and a management in water policy that maintains the security and the certainty for those farmers, those lenders are to continue to lend, and we won't see a catastrophe in farmland values like we did in the 1980s.
Cora, I want to ask you a pair of questions about uh, the situation in tribal communities. But I want to start by asking, like, when we talk about the needs, the water needs of tribal communities, are we making a mistake in assuming that like this is a monolithic group of people that, has all the same needs? Like, does the Navajo Nation have different or similar needs to the Hopi community, to, communities down in the metro area versus other, the Colorado River Indian tribes? Like, are we making a mistake in not differentiating what each individual tribe actually needs and wants?
Yes, I think it would be a mistake to see tribes in that monolith um, aspect. We have 22 tribal nations here in Arizona, 30 within the Colorado River Basin. And to think about the laws and regulations that have been imposed on these sovereign nations and how they have to manage within the ever changing policy structure is complicated in itself. And I think when we talk about water issues for tribes, we're not just talking about Western water law, we're talking about Indian law. And so I don't know if many have seen the last Navajo Nation Supreme Court case that came out last summer. That case, although it was very specific to Navajo, reflects and has this ripple effect across all of Indian country for the 574 tribes. So when tribal leaders and tribal advocates are working on tribal water laws, that affects every other tribe because we are in this federal and state policy system that has built itself on this structure. And so thinking about the 22 tribal nations we have in this state and where they're at in their water progress is super important and critical. And that context, I think, is important to flesh out in every conversation. What the Gila River Indian community and Colorado River Indian tribes have the ability to do is a product of having their rights quantified and having political capital, human capital, the placement of where they're at, and also being neighbors to central and southern Arizona, where we're they're right down the road from the capital. Thinking about northern Arizona tribes, the Havasupai and Wallapai tribes who are in very remote places don't have that same luxury. And also, the unquantified tribes are at square one and are not even in these same conversations. So, to think about how tribes have been able to advocate for themselves and be a part of discussions like this is very much a product of not only their political power, but also how much internal capital they have. So, there's a big need for building up that human capital and generational capital within tribal communities to be able to be a part of the solution.
So when the tribal communities are trying to do that and get their seat at the table and make sure their voices are heard, their needs are heard, how much more complexity does it add that you are essentially adding another layer of government? You have the federal government, in some cases you have the state government, occasionally you'll have like municipal governments, and then you have a tribal government on top of that. That's a lot of government there.
Yeah. And it's hard, thinking about the dynamics for each tribe and their relationship with the federal government, the history of land disposition and water disposition in their own community is a one-to-one relationship with the federal government, but also those tribes have relationships with the state and their local neighbors. And so thinking about the farmers and ranchers that lived here in the valley have and their history with the state and the federal government is a lot different than the Navajo Nation. And so something I'm thinking about this year as we're thinking about different changes in laws is just that 100 years ago today I wouldn't be considered a United States citizen, although the Colorado River Compact was already in place 2 years prior. And 30 years before that, my community was being forced marched to Bosque Redondo in New Mexico. So thinking about how all these different aspects of not only my community in place of water history and that historical trauma that's built into that is hard to deal with and is an added layer. But it's so important to have all of those necessary government officials at the table because tribes are a unique stakeholder in this conversation, and that is a product of their sovereignty that was not given to tribes by any other government, but is a recognition of that sovereignty that existed. And I think to discount any of that accessory and accessory work that goes into all of these conversation is a disservice to tribal sovereignty. So I think it's an added layer, but it's also very necessary and something that I think tribes want protected.
Sure. All right. So we are running short on time. So I want to ask one last question to each of you. We started this conversation by talking about magic wands. So I'd like to end by talking about crystal balls because another thing that none of us has, and if we do, it's probably cloudy and doesn't work. So look into your crystal balls. And if we were to be having this kind of conversation in, let's say, 5 or 10 years from now, what would this conversation sound like in terms of the politics of water in Arizona? What kinds of things are we talking about? What kinds of things have we done or not done? What kinds of political fighting or compromises maybe have we reached, that kind of thing? And since I started with Warren in the first question, Bruce, I'll start with you. Put you on the spot first on this one. How about that?
Crystal ball, 5 years. Now, I'm part of that aging workforce, if you haven't noticed.
I don't think he was talking specifically about you.
Okay,
Don't worry.
thank you. We've talked about the Colorado River 5 years from now, resolved, right? And resolved to the point where Arizona isn't heavily negatively impacted when it comes to access to its resources. I think another item too is there are areas in rural Arizona, and we've talked a little bit about that, Stephanie and myself, on where there are serious issues associated with aquifer depletion. So I would hope that we have a rural management scheme in place that is a scheme in place that locals are actively involved in the management of that water supply, but ensuring that you have a long-term resilient supply of water, protecting those rural economies. Unfortunately, they don't have that today, and here in the major metropolitan areas, we have renewable water supplies. These rural areas don't. And so we want to work together with them to ensure that they have a long-term reliable supply of water while they have a very healthy economy. And so I would hope that that would be another piece. And then another item is that we have most of the Indian water settlements in place within 5 years. There's a big one that's on the table right now that we're working on, the Navajos. So I would hope that that would also be another item. And if you notice, the reason I'm bringing all these up again, it provides certainty, right? You want to know what you have, and then you can plan forward for that. And then I guess lastly here within the active management areas, where we're looking at some limits when it comes to water supplies, I would hope that we would have some innovative projects in place and partnerships in place that are addressing the short-term needs for long-term reliable supply of water, whether it's potential leasing, whether it's a new dam, whatever it might be, so that we've at least have something in place from a short-term perspective to ensure that we're addressing some of these existing problems today. But I can tell you that it's going to take a lot more investment if you look at anticipated growth patterns within this state. We're going to have to go out and probably find additional water supplies, but not within the next 5 years.
All right, Cora, if you're looking in your crystal ball 5 or 10 years down the road, what do you see this conversation looking like?
I think in 10 years, we would have a lot more clarity, hopefully, with whether that comes from settling in water rights claims or this investment in technology and database research. I think that we have the incredible opportunity and desire to want to develop research that doesn't just look in a silo, but looking statewide, and also how that connects to the basin. And I hope in 10 years we do have these federal regulations like the post 2026 guideline established, of course, and here within the state, rural groundwater management in place to be able to look at what the picture is and build from that.
All right, Stephanie, 5 or 10 years down the road, what do you think?
Well, we haven't even talked about the adjudication, and now I realize that I wasted my wish. But anyway, um, I think what it would be is I would hope, and I'm going to say 10 because 5 goes by really fast. So I think maybe a slightly more realistic answer would be 10. But I would hope that we've taken a serious look all across Arizona to what we can do in our watersheds and managing I know SRP is doing a lot to manage the forest, but there's a lot of work that can be done in Arizona to manage brush in our watersheds in our rural communities. We don't talk about that very much, and that's something that we can augment our supplies with. I would hope that the communities that are experiencing serious struggles right now, by that time, and I hope it's way before 5 years, I hope that we have a rural groundwater management framework, and way before 5 years. We really care about that and we want to do it right. And so I would hope that would be in place. But along with that, I would hope that there are people in those communities that are taking serious thought into, okay, what kind of projects can we put into place to, water detention type, structures to bring more water into the basin itself. And there's a lot of crop research that's happening right now in a lot of universities across the Southwest, because this isn't just an issue in Arizona. These are issues that are being faced across our region. And there's a lot of crop research happening. And so I would hope that there are new crop potentials, new varieties that are available for farmers to use. And so, I could go on with a long list, but that those come top of mind.
Okay. And Warren, what do you think? 5 or 10 years or both?
I'll take something in between. I'll
Okay.
just say that, for the municipalities here, I just want to make sure everyone knows and that there is a concerted effort looking at how they can provide water in the next 5, 10, 20, 30, 40, etc. onward in the future. I believe that all of the folks here at this table and the entities that we represent, as well as others, are wanting to see and make sure that Arizona stays wet and has the water for the needs of all sectors. I would hope, I'll be echoing some of the things that have already been said, but that by then we'll have certainty about how the Colorado River is and what our supply of water is going to be from that important source. And I would hope that it may be from tough discussions. I'm expecting a roller coaster ride between now and the end of 2026. But I would hope and I believe that there will be creative partnerships among sectors to figure out a way how to make sure here in Arizona we continue to benefit from that resource. I would envision that we have continued to do what we've done in the past, and that's invest in new supplies, and that we will be creative from everything from seeing at that time advanced water purification treatment being done in many places, and that we're being able to continually to reuse our water and make every drop count. There'll also be Bartlett Dam expansion, so we'll have that supply. I'm hoping that we'll also be creative, as was mentioned, about watershed management and making sure, because that is so important for this region and for this state, as well as looking at maybe some creative ways of how to put to use stormwater, both here in the urban area as well as in rural Arizona, into a more effective way. And that at that, and in 5 to 10 years that we'll be seeing that we still have strong water management, that the Assured Water Supply Program will have brought about new designated providers who would then also be interested in investing in new supplies so that we have this collective effort or economy of scales as we go forward. You know, when people ask me what I do and I tell them I work in water, I often get the question of, oh, well, when are we going to run out of water? And I like to pause and maybe tease them a bit, but then I emphasize we will run out of water when we stop planning, managing, and investing in our water resources and infrastructure. And I firmly believe that. And in the realm of water and how it spills over into politics, I would hope that we continue to remember that H2O is not red or blue. It is an important resource for all of us. And I am confident that we will continue to be able to meet the water demands of our communities.
All right, that is about the time we have for tonight. Thank you to all of our panelists for joining us and sharing their insights. But a big round of applause for Warren Tenney, Stephanie Smallhouse, Cora So, Bruce Hallen. Thank you guys very much. Really appreciate it. Thank you. Thank you, of course, to all of you for coming. Thanks to everybody who was watching online for your questions, of course. And also thanks, of course, to the Walton Family Foundation. A reminder that if you have missed any of the coverage of water on KJZZ, it is available online, water.kjzz.org. You can also find a recording of tonight's discussion in case you just can't get enough of it and want to watch it in its entirety, all 90 minutes of it again. So thank you again for coming. Thank you for your interest, and thank you for your questions and for your support. Thank you. Good night.